Welcome back to the Philos Project podcast. I'm your host, Dominique, and in today's episode, I'm going to be talking with my colleague, Simone Rizkallah, about the theological root to the cultural and political anti-Semitism we are seeing today. This is a reaction to my last video on Christ is King and how that slogan and that movement has become anti-Semitic and is not a simple declaration of faith. I will be representing the Protestant perspective in the conversation, and Simone is very well-versed, used to be a teacher of Catholic history and theology, so she is an amazing authority to speak on the subject. I hope you enjoy the episode. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the episode. Simone Rizkallah, welcome back to the Philos Project podcast. Welcome back.
Thank you, Dominique. I'm so happy to see you today. Happy to record this.
Yeah, me too. I would love to just get a brief introduction to yourself and then your podcast here at Philos and your recent conference, just to kind of contextualize what you work on, because I think it's really related to this topic today, which is why I wanted to have you on to talk with.
Yes. Well, Simone Rizkallah, I am the director of Philos Catholic Special Project at the Philos Project. And we also, under Philos Catholic, we house the Coalition of Catholics Against Anti-Semitism. That it was founded 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago now. And we also educate Western Catholics, primarily Roman Catholics, on our Hebraic and Near Eastern Christian roots. So our Jewish roots are Hebraic roots, and also our Eastern Catholic churches. There's 24 Catholic churches. One of them is Rome, but the rest are all in the Eastern. So in a nutshell, that's what I do.
It's amazing. And it's a big feat because, as we're going to talk about today, there's been a lot of pushback in the Christian community against this idea that the Jews are God's chosen people and support for Israel. I think there's multiple reasons for that. Obviously, the war in Israel on the right has become a point of division, with America First policy becoming this idea of traditional conservative values. And with that, the slogan Christ is King is often used simultaneously with America First policy. And I recently did a video on Christ is King, and I talked about Candace Owens, who is converted to Catholicism. And I could speak very briefly about what that meant as far as the implications with Christ is King, but I thought having you on to help bring more depth to the conversation and also your perspective as a prominent Catholic who is in the pro-ecumenical and then also Jewish Catholic space on to talk about it. So I guess at the top, let's just talk about Christ is King, because there's a lot of really angry comments in my comment section. You get many angry comments in your inbox all the time. So just to frame it, from your Catholic perspective, because obviously I'm speaking from a Protestant perspective, what are some of the underlying issues with Christ as King, and why do you think it's kind of reached ahead in the cultural conversation?
Yeah, it's a strange phenomenon going right now that we're seeing primarily from the Catholic right online on social media. And they're taking a legitimate phrase, Christ is King, that I believe that is true, that Christ is King. It's biblical and theologically true for Catholics to embrace, but they're using it for very perverse reasons, which is very offensive to me. I actually, Dominique, I don't know if I've ever told you this, but I love the Feast of Christ the King. That is the last feast day on a Sunday before our new liturgical year. So right before we begin Advent, which is the beginning of the new liturgical year, we have the Feast of Christ the King, which is a feast that was instituted by Pius XI in a document where he is reminding the world against secularism and atheism that Christ is King. And it's a beautiful phrase. It's a beautiful feast day. And I've always loved it. I feel like this year when I celebrate it, it's going to hurt because it's being used in a perverse and blasphemous way. It's in a way that's taking the Lord's name in vain. What's interesting, and I don't know if Catholic fundamentalists who use it improperly and blasphemously will like to know this, but Christ as King is rooted in our Jewish roots, right? So Rosh Hashanah is the Jewish New Year, where God as King of the universe is emphasized. And I actually published an article on Church Pop talking about that. So when Jews celebrate the New Year, Rosh Hashanah, and we celebrate the last feast before our New Year, God is King of the universe, Christ is King. It actually comes from our Jewish roots as almost everything from our Catholic faith does. So again, especially painful that it's being used against the Jewish people in a blasphemous way. So yeah, that's the beginning of an answer to your question. If you wanted me to develop it more, I'm happy to.
Yeah, I would love to hear your response to, and this was in my comment section. I'm going to refer back a lot to my
Yeah.
comment section because this is largely a reaction to it. But this idea that, who are non-Christians to tell Christians they can't declare Christ as king, and kind of appealing to this almost victimhood or like martyr defense of like, I'm being told I can't say a fundamental truth of the Christian faith. And we talked before getting on air that that's really similar to how BLM is used. So I would love to kind of get your thoughts on that and what you would say to someone who's like, well, who are you to say I can't say Christ is king? It's not anti-Semitic.
Sure. The kind of Catholic anti-Semites that I get comments from will, of course, not say that they're anti-Semitic, right? I'm not being anti-Semitic. That's a legitimate phrase. A point that Trent Horn makes that's a very good point is, I'm from an Egyptian background, and the phrase Allahu Akbar, God is greater, right? That's a legitimate phrase. God is great. God is greater. God is the greatest. But it's often used by jihadists, right? So it's a legitimate phrase that's been taken and is used for terrorism. So that is painful, right? And doesn't bring God glory. When you use a legitimate phrase to support your Jew hatred or anti-Semitic ideologies, that doesn't bring God glory. And the thing that I found so weird, Dominique, is that, and it took me a while to like figure this out, I think, is that those social media handles that tend to do that kind of stuff will use words like, monarchy, the state, monarchy. And so they're using the phrase Christ is king to make some sort of political point, which is the exact opposite. Christ is king. And we note this, and my friend, Dr. Gomes, we were talking about this recently, how offensive this is, that in the Gospel of John, the throne of Christ the King is the cross, right? And Jesus says, kingdom is not of this world. So to take this phrase, Christ is king, and then to use it to propel your extreme right wing ideology is exactly the opposite of why we have this feast day, and is exactly the opposite of biblical Christianity, is exactly the opposite of the gospel, which the temptation to reduce the gospel to politics, to moralism, that's a temptation that's always been there, but it's still wrong. And as you mentioned, there's a great piece in Voices by Mikhail Olson about kind of comparing the misuse of the phrase Christ is king with the misuse of the phrase Black Lives Matter. Everybody who is a normal person agrees Black Lives Matter. But Black Lives Matter, the BLM movement, was really never about Black Lives Mattering. It was to perpetuate the other extreme political leftist ideology. So you have Christ is king that's promoting this right-wing ideology, BLM promoting left-wing ideology. And the point is that the true, the good, the beautiful, and especially as expressed in the gospel, is being thrown out and being used and being spiritually abusive, I would say, to people who are like, wait a minute, Christ is king is legitimate. It is, but now it's being used in very evil ways. And so I'm not saying don't use it, but we can tell the difference between someone who's using it in the spirit of the gospel and someone who's using it to perpetuate Jew hatred.
And context really matters. There's kind of a move on the conservative right, both within the Catholic circles and then Protestant circles, to be like, oh, but I'm just saying Christ is king. And it's like, okay, well, let's look at then the political views you espouse. And if you're saying Christ is king as then your defense for being anti-Israel, anti-Zionism, then there is like a correlation there that's quite evident and quite obvious.
Exactly. I mean, we posted something on Philos Catholic just saying anti-Semitism is a sin, which is Catholic teaching. When someone reads that and then posts Christ is king, well, why are you saying that? Yes, Jesus the Jew is king and he is Lord. What a weird response to that. You're not really using it in a way that's bringing God glory, in a way it's bringing the Jewish Christ glory.
Yeah. No,
So, yeah.
I think Your analogy with Allahu Akbar is really a really powerful one. I didn't think about that one myself. I even reading like the scripture, when Christ is crucified, above his head, the sign reads Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. But the Romans weren't like amplifying that as a truth. They were mocking what Christ declared himself as. So just because it's written somewhere or it's said doesn't mean it is affirming a biblical truth or is a declaration of faith. And I just think to fall back on this really lazy argument that, oh, but I'm just declaring a truth as a Christian, is I think that's kind of where the blasphemy lies also, because you're hiding behind it.
That's a great point, Dominique, that it like that was King of the Jews was a sign of mockery, right? And this is now mocking actually Christ as king. And the modern popes, I'm thinking of Pope Leo in particular, his call to devotion, this is in one of his documents, to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, that in modern times what we need is devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, and that renewal of the church, and that returning the world to God's sovereignty wasn't going to come from a quote new Constantine, to borrow the words of a professor, Dr. Russ Hittinger, right? That it was going to come from the Sacred Heart. So that's contrast. Sometimes things are very, very like nuanced and hard to unpack, but the absolute contrast of the way that the phrase is being used with the way that the phrase is being directed to be used in the church, it couldn't be more different. I wish more of, these, listen, I kind of gave up trying to, wrestle with Catholic fundamentalists who are attached to their anti-Semitism, but God can change hearts anytime he wants. But I think now it's more educating just normal lay Catholics that, to remind us all that Jesus was serious when he said, my kingdom is not of this world, right? And the way that we're actually going to embody Christ's kingship is to, as lay people, this is the teaching of the church, embody the priestly, prophetic, and kingly aspects of our baptism, which means that you and I, as Christians, as little Christ, are called to be priests, prophets, and kings by virtue of our baptism in the world to restore it to the temporal order. That is what that phrase is supposed to inspire us to do.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I also think too, which I don't adhere to this theological idea, but there are very fundamental, Catholics and Protestants who would say conversion for all, including the Jews, is the Christian's ultimate objective, is to minister to them and hope for their conversion. So even if you believe that you need to convert the Jews, as many Catholic fundamentalists might put forth, in order for them to be, once again, God's chosen people. My question to this whole community is like, well, do you think using this term in such an offensive and mocking and derogatory way is a good witness for Christ? Like, even if we don't share the same ideas of God's covenant with the Jewish people and the church, like, is that a very Christ-like approach? And I think you're kind of hitting the nail on the head, is like the heart of the Christian should not be to use a biblical declaration for a political aim that then also hurts people. Before we get into like the long history and also the many theological differences within Protestantism and then also within the Catholic Church when it comes to Israel and the Jewish people, we have many close Jewish friends working in this space. What are some of your just observations that this phrase, this movement has done to the hearts of people who are close to us, our Jewish brothers and sisters, our neighbors? What are like the real tangible implications of a term like Christ is King?
Yeah. Thanks for asking that. And can I just make one quick comment, Dominique, on what you just said about, I think Catholic fundamentalists, because I refuse to call them trads or traditionalists, because, that's offensive to all of us who consider ourselves Orthodox traditional Catholics, that we get accused of being religious relativists or, falling into dual covenant theology. That is simply untrue. Every Christian, every Catholic can affirm that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and that if anyone is saved, they're saved because of Jesus. We can still affirm that, and not, as you pointed out, if you're going to witness to the truth of who Jesus is this really the way? So telling to me that these people, it's so easy to slap Christ as King on a social media post or whatever. It's very difficult to be an actual real relationship with people.
Mhm.
And so to your point now about our Jewish friends, the conference that we just held in DC on March 10th about Catholics and anti-Semitism, I sent it to all my Jewish friends, and I was so moved at how moved they were. I actually had a friend's mom, after 20 years, I haven't talked to her, message me and say, I can't thank you enough for this, that you care about this and that you are working in this space. So it just goes a long way to even reach out, but it's been painful, honestly, with my Jewish friends, that they have to see this. And frankly, it's been painful for my Catholic friends, and I'm friends with a lot of Catholic educators, leaders, influencers, and we have a lot of like behind the scenes conversations about it. This is unrecognizable to us. Here's the bad news is this is happening. The good news is, for most of us, this is completely unrecognizable, and it's shocking, right? This is not the kind of church or the kind of spiritual abuse and the kind of blasphemy that we grew up with and are used to at all. So it's terribly, terribly painful. And we just got to keep our eyes on Jesus, because this is his tribe. Yeah.
And I do believe and we've talked about this just personally over the years working together, that there's just like this demonic also assignment. And you mentioning like this isn't the either church theology or the anti-Semitism you grew up with in the church, so it's hard to recognize it. I think that there is a moment we're in just spiritually that we're seeing very old anti-Semitic tropes or ideas being presented as like new. And I think that's like fundamentally where I get frustrated with Candace Owens or someone of her influence kind of presenting these conspiratorial ideas, whether it be about the atomic bomb in Nagasaki or like Marxism or the assassination of JFK, like trying to reveal the truths of history as being the source of like some Jewish cabal that's running history and society, and they're greedy. And she even kind of painted Ben Shapiro as loving money more than God. But these ideas are not new. But the whole young generation of Gen Z or maybe younger millennials think that she's enlightening them with the truth. Like she's a truth teller. She's, pushing through the conspiracy to bring these new ideas to light when really they're not new at all. They're just reimagined or repurposed, or sometimes not even repurposed ideas that plagued the Jews throughout the entire Middle Ages. And it shapeshifts, like anti-Semitism is very shapeshifting. But a lot of what we're hearing today reminds me of interwar Europe and just culturally held ideas about the Jewish people. And we see what that extreme endpoint leads to, which is the Holocaust. And that's why I'm so passionate about talking about this, because you see the popularity in these ideas kind of gaining some momentum. And I think it's also because now we're a few generations removed from the living memory of the Holocaust. And so I think there's a spiritual dimension, and then also just the time and history that we're currently sitting in. So I would love to go to the historic perspective, and just for the audience's kind of framework with this episode, I'll just represent the Protestant perspective, and then Simone has the Catholic history and theology perspective. But before I even get into that, because I saw comments on my last video, I was talking just about Candace Owens, and people were like, well, it's also happening in Protestant circles as well. But the one disadvantage is that we don't have a centralized authority. Our history isn't documented and then kept in much of the same way. And we don't have a robust, unified social teaching. We have so many different denominations and different ideas. So it's hard to talk about the Protestant side. And so I'm not absolving the Protestant side at all in maybe my lack of information or context. It's just by nature of us being more decentralized than the church. But Simone, maybe we can visit some of the historic relationships between the church and anti-Semitism. I know that's what your recent conference was about. And in my last video, I pointed people to your panels, which are posted on the Philos Project channel here. So for more context, people can go look at that. But what's just the broad overview and kind of the precedent and then the context to which church doctrine such as Nostra Aetate was then birthed from, to kind of correct some of the either complicit role or just the silence that the church might have had during some of these historic anti-Semitic periods?
Oh my gosh, what a massive, massive question. And everything you just said was
all right,
so well, it was so well articulated. It makes me want to go into 5 different lanes in my brain, Dominique. And this is such a huge topic.
So
I'm just by way of introduction. If you're a Catholic and you're like, I don't know what is going on, what are these people even talking about? Go check out the conference. The conference is for you. Okay. Literally, is Catholic anti-Semitism still a problem? Short answer, yes. But we're unpacking it. Second panel is what's the history behind this? How is it that, like, where is this coming from? Okay. That's the second panel. And then the third panel is like, how do we respond? Okay. And then there's a great keynote by George Weigel, JP2's John Paul II's papal biographer, on basically John Paul II's sign. Listen, for Catholic, okay, let me put it this way. If you really want to go into this history, check out this book by Father Edward Flannery, right? The Anguish of the Jews, from start to finish, 23 centuries of anti-Semitism. If you want to get the full picture, I'm going to definitely fail on a broad overview here. So if you want the picture there, that book is a must read. But I think the big thing is that once we as Catholics decided that the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, the Old Testament was going to be part of our canon, right? Then we were going to be in relationship with the Jews. That we cannot sever it. We need them. They gave us most of the Bible. Okay. So that's the first. This relationship has not gone great so far in salvation history. Okay. It's painful to admit that. Part of the problem is, and this is what Catholic fundamentalists do, they kind of act like, no offense, Dominique, because you know how much I love Protestants, act like Protestants when they like pick and choose, right? Like this Bible, this scripture, that church teaching, that church father. But the point about the best part, at least for me, why I became a Catholic after, in my adult reversion, I was baptized an Armenian Catholic, but I, fully bought in, is because I believe in the authority of the church. This is Christ's church, and he's left an authority, and I am not out here as an existential orphan or a theological orphan. This scripture, this magisterium, this tradition has a magisterium that is our guide, right? So I don't get to just decide, I don't like Vatican II, or I like what St. John Chrysostom says about that. It's so weird in modern times that we have social media and that we have access to so much, because a little bit of knowledge can be really dangerous when it's taken out of context and out of the guidance of the magisterium. And then we become our own little popes, or we become our own little. So all that to say that is this relationship with the Jews has been very complicated because the church became very powerful politically. And so there was this, and you'll hear more about this in the second panel if you listen, from Dr. Richard Crane, a Benedictine, that the church and the synagogue were often at odds. And one of the things about St. John Chrysostom, and I'm not going to dumb down problematic scriptural verses or problematic statements from the church fathers, but one, Catholic fundamentalists need to remember that not everything that doctors of the church or the church fathers say is infallible church teaching. On the contrary. So everybody knows that, or everybody should know that. If you don't know that, you should. You can be today years old when you learn that. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is, along with those problematic scripture verses, like calling Jews the enemy of God, in the same passage, St. Paul, who is a Jew himself, talks about the beloved and the ongoing chosenness and their ongoing participation in the mystery of salvation. So I wish Catholics would read and pray and meditate with their Bibles, as well as evangelicals and Protestants too. Because if you're going to bring up this problematic verse, what about this positive verse? And the one thing Dr. Crane notes is that with St. John Chrysostom, unfortunately, his homilies incited this spirit of, wouldn't say anti-Semitism, but anti-Judaism, that led to modern anti-Semitism, you could say, over time, because it was never racist ideology was never in the theology of the church ever, or in any teaching of the church fathers. But anti-Judaism, yes. But the problem is that there was syncretism, so Judaizing Christians. So it wasn't really about the Jewish people in some context. It was really about these Christians who kind of were practicing the syncretism going on in the early Middle Ages. Okay. So again, this is probably one of the most complicated histories, theologies to sort through, and really something that is worth time, investment, study, and a lot of theological work. Again, I don't know if I'm giving a broad overview, but the fact that there is a history of anti-Judaism in the church, which led to modern day anti-Semitism, that's indisputable. And we need to make reparation for that, for the ways in which, even if it was never official church teaching, but it still led to persecution of the Jews. And we need to have a grown-up faith that is willing to talk about it and to make reparation for it.
I think that's a great point. I believe in panel 2, one of the panelists mentioned that anti-Jewish thought, whether it be culturally or religiously, was a necessary prerequisite to the Holocaust. And so we do have anti-Semitism, which is a word that, we use. It's in our common vernacular now. But I think a lot of people who might not identify, like you said too, a lot of people are like, no, I'm not anti-Semitic. Like I don't hate the Jews, but they might hold anti-Jewish theology, which then if, propagated or if made popular, like let's say with this Christ is King movement, is a really dangerous place to be.
Yeah. I mean, anti-Judaic sentiments led to modern anti-Semitism. That I would say is kind of indisputable. Today, those who will say, well, I'm not anti-Semitic, I don't hate Jews, but I actually think they're not just doing the whole anti-Judaism thing. They're actually anti-Semitic, because on the one hand, they'll say it's just about the religion. On the other hand, they're then accusing secular Jews who aren't even really practicing Judaism for being behind every conspiracy theory in the world and every
Yeah. No, it is. And that's how it's so shape-shifting. Like it's hard to pin down, or you even have people like Candace Owens, who I hate referencing her. I know I hate's a strong word, but like I just so dislike giving her even more
I just feel so
attention.
I feel so bad for her because
Yeah.
I just
And you
feel
can
bad.
see her
Yeah.
viscerally like foaming at the mouth, like actually. And I'm not saying that in like a like hyperbole or like trying to like speak ill of her, but you can tell there's just like this deep just suspicion and hatred for the Jewish people at large. And I think that's a great point, that like even if they might either identify themselves as like being anti-Jewish theologically, it manifests in other aspects of their worldview or what they talk about or what they believe. And then it's also so easy to be like, oh, but no, I'm not anti-Semitic. I just like don't think that, the Jews are still God's chosen people. That's
Yeah,
it.
if you're not anti-Semitic, then why are you accusing me, Simone, of being a Jew? Which wouldn't be a bad thing if I were. But like,
Right.
why is that insulting then? Why are you telling me I'm getting paid in shekels or
Yes.
paid by a Zionist, whatever, which is not true. Philos Catholic is funded by Catholics. But like, anyways, like it's just flat out weird. And I feel awful for Candace Owens. Before this work, I did women's ministry. Before women's ministry, I taught high school. Before teaching high school, I ran a church. And my goodness, Candace, you just became a Catholic. You should not be speaking at Catholic conferences. You should not be speaking authoritatively. You're a brand new Catholic. You be praying, studying, locking yourself up with the scriptures, getting spiritual direction, learning about our faith. Like you just use your platform to irresponsible. It's spiritually irresponsible. It's pastorally irresponsible, and she's wrong. And so it's painful to me that again, like Jonathan Silver said in the first panel of the conference, anti-Semitism hurts the anti-Semite, right? It hurts them. This is her soul that's in danger. All the people she's hurting, it's hurtful. It's dangerous. It could be leading other souls astray, but first and foremost, like this is her own soul she's got to be held accountable for. And that to me is tragic for a new convert, that she's so far off.
Yeah. And I think too, it's like this embrace of replacement theology, which then now me as the Protestant, I can come in and talk.
Yes, you
Although
can.
some of the Catholic fundamentalists love to call me, what do they call me? Like, you filthy prot. I'm like, oh, okay. Or also shekels. Like people will always be like,
talks that way? What kind of Christian talks that way?
and I'm like, so it's also like me as a Christian, I'm also as a Protestant on the receiving end of this just like very hateful language. Yeah, it's so interesting.
I've seen Catholic anti-Semites also. They're very awful to Protestants.
Yeah.
They're Jews are stupid because they just don't read the Bible in the right interpretation, which is really precious. And then Protestants are stupid too, because if you were smart, Dominique, you'd be a Catholic. I mean, it is so it's so offensive.
It is. It's such a bad witness. Even like, thank God, like I'm a Christian and I'm saved. So like my, potential faith journey to come into Christ is not in jeopardy. But imagine those who are just so turned off by that abrasive and offensive language.
Oh, I know. I consider my like deepest call as an evangelizer, and it is just painful that you have to spend all this time doing damage control because of all the bad witnessing. And St. Paul says in Romans 9-11, just read it, pray with it, read it, pray with it. Don't be arrogant. Don't be arrogant. Straight out of the word of God. Don't be arrogant. There's so much spirit of triumphalism and arrogance. Poor Jesus.
Yeah.
It just
No,
makes God look so bad. Just so bad.
bad.
Ruining his reputation. It's awful.
I know. Well, that's why we're here.
That's
to
why we're
combat
here.
it. And so one thing, like replacement theology, I think we could just like umbrella term kind of talk about maybe some of the anti-Jewish roots, because that also exists in the Protestant world. You have a lot of Reformed theology. I grew up in the South where a lot of Baptists are Calvinist, and they have a very intense and I believe incorrect interpretation of even who is saved from a Christian perspective and what even salvation is and who Christ atoned for on the cross. So I'm not surprised Calvinists get the Jewish component of their theology wrong, because I think they get salvation itself wrong. You have dispensationalism, and then you have evangelicals on the Protestant side who you could think of like John Hagee. So we have such a wide spectrum, but those who contribute to the anti-Jewish sentiments or ideas, or even like our not founding church fathers, we don't have a church, but you can think of Martin Luther or John Calvin, like these original Reformation fathers had very anti-Jewish sentiments, which have trickled down into modern theology. And just unfortunately, we don't have doctrine such as Nostra Aetate to correct that in a unifying way.
So and the documents before, for those who struggle with Vatican II, there are documents that predate Nostra Aetate that are before Vatican II that can be looked at seriously. I just want to note that, it's not just like Nostra Aetate, came before.
Well, let's start. No, that's perfect. Let's talk about what are some of the church doctrines that address this specific issue. And then why do some Catholic fundamentalists like reject Nostra Aetate? Because in my mind, I'm like, it's Catholic doctrine that should be universally either accepted or understood. Like, so what's the disconnect there? And what are some of the other church doctrines that a fundamentalist could look to as being part of, is that like the canon of the church or?
Yeah. So, okay, let me just say this. I grew up in a post Vatican II world, which I left the church because it was so silly. Right. There was like felt banner vibes and silly music and very watered down homilies. Nobody was really well catechized. Youth ministry was a joke. I mean, it was silly. And was that a authentic interpretation of the Second Vatican Council? No, it wasn't. But it was still my experience of living in a post Vatican II world. It was very liberal and very silly. So it was that extreme reduction of the gospel to like toxic sentimentality, kumbaya stuff. So now because humans are reactive, right? Being in relationship with Jesus is attention. Morality is attention, right? Because love is attention, and you have to hold things in balance. But now because we're such like little psychological creatures, we're reactive to the other extreme. Everybody's so mad about all that now it's like the reduction to the gospel to moralism, right? To the rules and to this rigorism. And, that is also not the gospel. And Pope Benedict says it so beautifully in his encyclical God is Love, where the encounter with Christ is the heart of the gospel, right? Who changes your life and gives you a mission and a vocation and a decisive direction. Okay, so I can understand psychologically the allergy to quote Vatican II because of all the silly stuff that came, but it was still a legitimate council, and it needs to be read. The documents need to be read. It needs to be applied. It's the responsibility of every baptized Catholic, every baptized Christian to embody it, the true spirit of the council, which is not all the silly stuff that I mentioned before. Okay,
and really quick, Simone. Oh, sorry. I just want to say, as a Protestant, I love Nostra Aetate. That's kind of like the framework from which Protestants as well can understand the Jewishness of our faith and the Jewish
Yeah.
Messiah we believe in, because we don't have an equivalent in the Protestant world. So
Right.
for those listening who are not Catholic, and you might even not understand, because there is like also a rejection of traditional Catholicism as like being really rigorous and rule oriented, but not focused on a relationship with Christ. So a lot of Protestants hold like that prejudice against Catholicism. So you might be adverse to reading church documents, but I
Yeah.
absolutely love Nostra Aetate. So for Protestants also, it's a document for you as well to
Yes.
kind of glean and shape your theology from. But sorry, go ahead.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Dominique, because actually Nostra Aetate is a declaratio, which
Mhm.
is it's for the whole world. It's not just for
Mhm.
Catholics. So that is fun that you mentioned that. But let's just say you're on your journey and you're like, Nostra Aetate, it's a weak document, or I am just too psychologically or emotionally sensitive to Vatican II because of all the bad or whatever. So you can look to the Council of Trent, the Catechism 1566, that basically said, we are collectively guilty for the death of Jesus. So that deicide charge against the Jews,
Mhm.
Council of Trent, that's a really old council that, you know, is part of our tradition. We can look at documents from 1943. Pius the 12th talked about the collective guilt. I think it's Pius XI, 1938. Virtually, we are Semites. John the 23rd, 1959. Again, John the 23rd is considered a modern pope, but it's still before the council, although he called the councils. Again, the most traditional thing to be as a Catholic is in touch with your Jewish roots. And I would that more Catholics would read the scriptures and to grapple with the mystery of Israel. So I hope that's the beginning of an answer to your question.
No, that's great. I think that's something I wish Protestants were also comfortable with grappling with. I mentioned also this chart. I didn't show it, but just because it's so complicated, this is a chart by our director, Luke Moon. So I'm not going to plagiarize him. He does an amazing lecture on this. But I asked him for his slideshow because it kind of shows you, at least on like the Protestant side with Reformed, Armenian, and the mainline churches, all the different denominations and where they sit theologically and politically when it comes to Israel. So again, when I'm talking about the Protestant church, it's so impossible to talk about it in a monolithic way.
Yeah.
But for especially like the Reformed side of Protestant theology, I wish they were more comfortable with grappling with like the divine mystery of the chosen people and the Jews. And I think that's like a tension a lot of Christians don't either have the theological maturity to engage with, or it makes them uncomfortable with whatever their theological ideas of salvation are. But I'm in a class on modern Jewish Christian relations, and that is something that my Jewish peers and fellow students can't grapple with. They're like, well, like, how can Christians want to be friends with us as Jews? Because according to your idea of salvation, like we don't fit into it and we reject it. So like, how is there that kinship? And like this idea of a divine mystery, which I think is the language of the church is beautiful, is that there's no explicit like verse in the Bible where God then in the New Testament rejects the Jewish people as his chosen people, or his covenant is then said to be null and void. You have like a lot of armchair theology that would then stipulate and try and insert that. But people aren't comfortable saying it's a divine mystery, which really baffles me because there's many divine mysteries in the Bible that we don't know of. And I think the danger is when we as humans kind of come in and try and prescribe a concrete theology to something that it's not explicitly stated in the Bible.
Yeah, real quick with the chart. I hope that it gets updated to not just have Roman Catholic,
Yeah.
because there's 24 Catholic churches. No,
Well,
Rome's
I
just
get the
one of
default on. I
Rome's
didn't
just
make
one
it.
of them. It's okay. I know you didn't. I just had to like point that
No,
out
no, no.
for
It's
those
like
watching.
I'll have
But
to
I
message
think
you
you're
about
hitting
it.
on where I would like to see this relationship
Mhm.
go, right? Again, St. Paul gives us a lot to read and meditate on in Romans 9-11, right? That we're the wild olive shoot that is being grafted on to Israel, right? And that they're still part of God's plan for salvation, even though we have not put the mystery of Israel into a theological formula, because actually that's not how relationships work, right? So I would love to see the next 23 centuries we just like past the Christian, Catholic, whatever, anti-Semitism, right? And I love that Father Edward Flannery says, the blueprint for the extinction of Christian anti-Semitism is all in the documents. It just needs to get through faster, because then we can get out of damage control. We can get out of mere orthodoxy and into like actually a prophetic church. And so it's funny because I think that Protestants are so ahead of us when it comes to the prophetic imagination, Dominique. So it's kind of funny to hear you say, like, I want us to grapple with more. I'm like, really? I feel like you guys are light years ahead of us in some sense, at least in the lay sense, right? I feel like our church documents themselves are highly prophetic. I think I'm Catholic because the church is prophetic. But of course, like you mentioned, the documents are not very widely read or disseminated or taken seriously. And maybe they really wouldn't need to be should be taken as seriously if we actually read our scriptures properly. But anyways, St. Paul talks about prophecy as the greatest of the charisms in Corinthians, right? I would that you would all prophesy, because it's ordered towards the exhortation and the building of the church. He's not necessarily just reducing prophecy to foretelling, like telling the future, but that prophecy is for the building up of the church, of the body. And so when we prophesy in a fuller sense of the word, we're actually breathing the Holy Spirit life into the church. And so we can finally say, hey, let's get on the same page. The church has never taught replacement theology officially. She's never taught supersessionism. Has supersessionist thought and replacement theology kind of penetrated our psyches? Are we kind of functional supersessionists as Catholics? Yes, absolutely. Yes. I don't know how you can get out of it. Even I can't get out of it, but I'm trying, right? But there is much to unpack when Jesus says, I've not come to abolish, but to fulfill. I've not come to abolish. What does that even mean? What does it mean when St. Paul says that, again, we're not falling into dual covenant theology. We're not falling into religious relativism, but we're saying that we are intrinsically tied. We have a relation, this is the church teaches, we have a special relationship with the Jews that we have with no other people. And that's all part of the mystery of salvation. And while we don't have it unpacked the way that certain Protestant theologies do, we still have a theology of that. There is still a theology of the mystery of Israel, which Pope Benedict has asked us to reflect on. There's so much theologically to like grapple with and prophesy about and to unpack. And we haven't even made a dent in it. So there's that kind of what I find theologically exciting. What does it mean to be in relationship with my Jewish brothers and sisters? In no way saying like, Jesus is unnecessary for you. That's not what I'm saying. But there is a way that you're fitting into the plan of salvation, so much so that I shouldn't be arrogant, right? Because I claim to recognize who I believe the Messiah is. And then I think, let's say you're just not into the theology stuff. You're like, whatever, cool. I'm just not going to be anti-Semitic, and maybe I'll have some Jewish friends, but I'm not interested in like grappling with the mystery of Israel the way that you are, Simone. Culturally speaking, we have actual paganism and neo-paganism and all these left and right-wing political ideologies, secularism, atheism that's like emerging. And the Gen Z religious guys who are becoming religious are like falling into some of these really weird spaces. How about if we get together shoulder to shoulder with our biblical values that we got from the Hebrew Bible and actually start to make a case for the building up of the true, the good, the beautiful, and the civilization together? How about that? That's exciting too. I mean, can we get past the anti-Semitism so we can do all that other fun stuff, whether you want to do it theologically or culturally or whatnot? So those are my dreams, Dominique. Those are my dreams.
No, I think it's like such an obvious point to make that with all the attacks on the Judeo-Christian West, the most natural partner for Christians to have would be our Jewish neighbors in helping preserve that. And this like weird infighting on like the trad, I'll just call it trad, like just even politically on the right.
Yeah.
It's so odd to me. And that's where I would just default back on the like objective of like the Candace Owenses of the world is so perplexing to me, and it almost contradicts who she claims herself to be as this traditional Catholic woman, that I just like I have to believe that it's like a demonic
it's
assignment to like
disorienting.
disorient the truth of the gospel in a modern sense. And I know that like maybe that's a little bit too woohoo for some people in the audience to talk about like the spiritual realm, but I think you can't make the distortion of history, the revision of history to be, all the Jews' fault, the center of it, or like carrying that charge of deicide all the way through to today as like this spiritual curse on the Jewish people as well. And then tying that into the war with Israel and then being pro Hamas, even though they're contrary to everything you would believe as a Christian to be true, capital T. Like that has to be like that confusion and that upside down like logic has to be demonic and part of some larger spiritual warfare.
I agree with you. And I think that if you're a Christian listening and you're reading the scriptures, you know that the demonic is very real. So it might be too much for you because you don't engage it, but take a look at Jesus performing exorcisms and, you know, it's all very real. And I agree with you, Dominique. It's very disorienting, even extremely disorienting. There's a mental illness component, I firmly believe. And I know that I get accused of kind of wanting to reduce everything to mental illness, but I do think that grace builds on nature. And so the demonic also builds on nature. So there's mental illness, there's the demonic element. And why wouldn't it be? Jesus is from the Jews. Salvation is from the Jews, also in the scriptures. So of course, the root, right? That we are grafted onto is going to be where the pain points are. And I find a lot of consolation. My friend, Father James Brent, taught me and reminded me that 5 times in the Last Supper discourse, Jesus prays and promises for the Spirit of truth, the Spirit of truth. And so that has been my prayer this whole last year, that the Spirit of truth that Jesus promises 5 times in the Last Supper will overshadow the world, because that is the only thing that's going to save us from all these reductions of the gospel and ideologies that are really hurting our Lord, hurting our church, hurting the world, making a mockery of him. And it's just painful. And like you said so well, aligning ourselves with, you know, people who hate us, you know, strangely. Like the same people who hate Jews also hate Catholics and hate Christians at the heart of it all. So
yeah, because it's first the Saturday people, then the Sunday people. I know that your family and coming from Egypt understands that like very well. And unfortunately, I don't think a lot of people in the West, they have the luxury of not having the perspective. I guess in closing, Simone, I think you landed the conversation that was very complex and there's so many historic and theological layers very well, and that just praying for truth through it all to be kind of the prayer for Christians like me and you who see in the spiritual realm too the dangers of what's happening and the deep rooted anti-Semitism of Christ as King as a slogan, but the movement at large, and just praying against that as really an evil force, which I know, again, for the audience who might not be as into the spiritual world or the spiritual realm might sound scary, but I think you have to also acknowledge that dimension.
Yep. Amen. Thank you so much, Dominique.
Thank you so much, Simone. Where can the audience follow the Beyond Rome podcast and everything else Philos Catholic is doing?
Oh, thank you so much. If you're Catholic and listening to this, we'd love for you to sign the Coalition of Catholics Against Anti-Semitism statement. So check out CatholicsAgainstAntisemitism.org, and you can follow at Philos Catholic on X and Instagram. Please check out our website, philosproject.org/Catholic. We have the Beyond Rome podcast, and please listen to the conference and send it to your priests, your pastors, your youth ministers, your seminary formators, anybody who's a place of influence. It's a great primer on bringing everybody up to speed on what's been going on. Thank you again, Dominique, for letting me.
Thank you, Simone. And we'll have to do another episode on like first the Saturday people and the Sunday people, and kind of
I love that
other dimension, the odd dimension of some of these trad conservatives aligning with Islamist and the Islamic world. Well, thank you so much, Simone. I'll see you in the next episode when we come back together.